Hello, Tamber. Welcome.
Thank you, Kathy.
I'm so excited for you guys to connect with Tamber. She is one of my favorite people in this world. And her husband were really so gentle and kind in this like soft landing place for us when we were going through our hard things. And Tamber's husband, Jordan, on multiple occasions would just show up and just be there right in the moments when my husband really needed him. And they just have always just had this very beautiful connection with them. We don't see each other as much as we'd like, but it was 2 years ago when we had moved, and Tamber and Jordan and their cute little boys had come over for dinner, and we were just kind of catching up. And Tamber is a professor that as a social work professor that works with master level students. And she was sharing about a class that they were working on these, Tamber, correct me if I'm wrong, like these 60 students that are doing these internships and kind of their coursework. And you said a phrase that was really, really impactful. And I'd love to dive into that in a little bit. But before we kind of jump into all that, do you mind sharing a little bit about your journey and how you ended up in Utah and teaching social work?
Yeah, sure. I am from California. I am the second oldest of four girls. And I always knew I wanted to go into education, that I wanted to be a teacher. I come from a long family of teachers, long line of teachers. And in doing so, I also wanted to do psychology. I was always really driven to people and relationships and a sense of community. When I was 16, my parents were in a car accident, and at the hospital, our family and a bunch of friends were put in this really tiny room, and there was a guy there with a clipboard and a name tag, and he had to tell us that our mom wasn't going to make it. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, this is a horrible job. Like, who signs up to do this at 16? And I thought, you know what? That's exactly what I need to do. No one should go through this experience alone. And through that experience, I was like, okay, that is my calling in life. And so from 16 on, I just was very driven to get an undergrad degree in psychology, got my master's in social work, and right out of graduate school, I worked in pediatric hospice for about 10 years and loved it. It really created a balance, and it was something that I felt comfortable addressing with families, probably because I'd been there. But I'm also very comfortable sitting and having hard conversations, being comfortable around the expression of emotion. Um, and so when the opportunity came for me to start teaching at the master's level, I jumped on it and started teaching a class for grief therapy. And I've been doing that for about 7 years. And then I took a position working in the field education department, which is where you and I started talking, Kathy, about how do you nurture the potential in individuals who go out there and work in the trenches with people who are really suffering. And what does that look like?
Thank you for sharing that. I am often amazed how often it shows up in my own life and in the lives of others when we have this yearning and almost this knowing of taking our grief and our loss and being able to use that as a gift to be what you wish you had in that moment. And then knowing that is created when we go through extremely tragic things, that it gives us such like a depth of compassion that it is kind of this knowing that we then have to know what to do in those situations, right? Like it is not something you would wish on anyone, but it then allows us from that stretching, from that growth, and from that heartache to sit in compassion, to sit with grief. And like you're saying, like you don't shy away from the hard conversations. And that is such a beautiful gift that was planted at 16, and to now be at this place where you're able to use even your tragedy to help move forward these students.
Yeah. And I would say in our recent culture, our world is grieving, and we see that constantly being displayed everywhere we look. And so I think sometimes we get numb to it, and we try to normalize it. And in doing so, we minimize people's grieving experiences. And I'm not talking about just death, I'm talking about loss of what normal life looks like, loss of relationships, loss of, our identities. All of that has a profound effect on who we are. And it's hard to find people that we can sit and who will listen to that, and not necessarily switch it and turn it back about them. Like when we sit down with our girlfriends and we're talking about what's happening in our family, or like family stress, someone will share a story and then someone else will jump in and share their story. When you're sitting with someone who's grieving, you really want to focus that time and energy on that one person, because our culture doesn't allow that very often. And that's what's healing to our grief and to our grief story is it being heard and allowing us to share it from our own experience, not trying to filter it by any means how someone else is going to perceive it or accept it or not accept it.
Let's go back to that a little bit more, because I've probably over the last 3 years recognized that's a pattern that I have. That's something I do work on, but it still shows up unexpectedly. And I think at the heart of it, like, it's really this desire for connection. It's not always this one-upmanship, right? Like, it's not like,
Correct.
well, my day's so crappy and this and this and this, but it's really this desire, I think, for connection. But because that's what we've been shown and what we've taught, that's typically like how we respond. So share a little bit about when the next time, our listeners are with someone that is grieving, maybe a couple of steps of what can that look like from a, being really present standpoint and listening, and maybe what questions you can ask.
Oh, great questions. I think the first thing, and this is what we teach professionals, is listening, to actively listen and engage in the listening component. And that's asking questions that would be helpful to the person who's sharing the story, not to me. So, for example, if someone shares with me that, let's say I run into an old neighbor at a store, and they share that they're getting a divorce, and I know both parties. I'm not going to ask what happened. Like, the curious person in us, the one that likes to watch TV and those kind of mystery solving shows, but more of a curious of, how are you? What are you doing to take care of you? What can I do to help? But be sincere in asking that question. How are you getting downtime? Can the kids come over and play? Just sending a text or phone call a week later and say, hey, I'm thinking of you. Those pieces that let others know that you care, and not necessarily what's the story that's being shared, is probably of utmost importance. I think in these last few years where we've had, because of a pandemic, we've had limited contact with our community. One of the things that I've tried to pay attention to are who in my neighborhood don't have as many contacts, who doesn't really get to share that. There's a really good book I just finished reading called Cured, A Life-Changing Science of Spontaneous Healing. And the author talks in there about human contact, and we get more healing and connection from our 5-minute conversation with our postal service man than our family we talk to out of state. Like it's that
Wow.
energetic relationship that we have, that touch point where we're connecting with someone in the flesh, that is more healing than
Mm.
a loving phone call with someone that we love. And that's just physiologically. And so to me, I, borrow books from neighbors who are more quiet and kept to themselves. I take over extra food that I have, or, remove snow, just little things that don't take a lot of my time, where they feel indebted to me, but they know that I care and I'm really wanting to connect with them. And I think that's what happens, bringing it back to the grief. That's the message that you want to relay to the person who's sharing their story, not necessarily the details of the story. The other piece is when we get nervous as humans, we tend to talk and fill
Never,
silence, right?
never.
And so a lot of times what they need is silence. They need the heaviness of what's happened to them. And again, I think that goes back energetically, being able to expel that energy, that the heaviness of the energy they're experience, and allowing you to hold it in silence.
That is powerful. And that ability to simply be with someone and to hold space for that someone. Sometimes it is physical, sometimes it's not. But yeah, creating that space and that container so that there can be silence, and to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable with the silence too.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And I notice that even in myself, the more I practice it, the easier it is. And the longer I go between practicing that silence, the more I intuitively want to fill that gap. I want to start talking. I want to start sharing. But I know that more healing can come from that space where I'm just holding. I'm that vessel to allow them to spill over what is too much for them to contain. um, Hold it, and then also need to let it go myself.
Talk a little bit about that, because this is an area of my life that I am working on, is realizing, especially with my kids, like I take on a lot of that emotion. And I haven't been so good at letting it go. And then I confuse their emotions with mine.
Yeah. I think if you're in a health helping profession, we are really good at that. We're really good at being vessels to take it on, but shedding it and letting go is the piece that we get to be challenged with and address. So one of it is consciously for me, and everyone processes things differently. So for me, um, I'm a real cognitive, emotional person. And so in the moment, I have to tell myself, this is someone else's experience. This is my son's experience of what it's like to be rejected by friends. And I can't fix that. um I want to. I want to like call up the little kid and tell him how I feel as the mama bear, but allowing my child to feel those emotions, and a lot of times that's sitting with it. It's the same thing I'm doing with my clients and my friends. I'm sitting with it. So, I'm pulling them over into a physical hug or a hold and saying, "I'm sorry, that's got to feel bad, sad," and giving them the vocabulary to recognize what they're feeling. um, and then to also resist the urge to make them feel better. Can I give you something to like make that feeling go away, and not just allowing them to feel it? And then the hug, and the children especially know when they've had enough and they need to move on, and they'll pull
Mm.
away and go play. And then I'll come back and I'll check in with them like, "Hey, thank you for sharing that. I know it's hard when we feel rejected from our friends and we feel like we're the ones that were left out." It reminds me that
Yeah.
when I'm with my friends, that I need to be mindful that everyone's feeling included. So the object lesson comes
Yeah.
way after the
Yeah.
experience of allowing them to express the emotion and being comforted from the connection they're making with me.
And the area that I get to work on is this being okay with their discomfort. And yeah,
It's
that's
really hard.
hard. It's really hard because especially when they were little, right? Like we can solve the problem, we can get the toy, we can fix the toy, we can do all that. But then when you're 14 and you've got really big life things showing up and it's just hard. And watching our children grieve and knowing that it is something that only they can experience. It's part of life and it's uncomfortable. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, it's very uncomfortable. But I also tell myself, you know what, I want them to learn these things along the way so that when they are adults, they're not slammed with these huge emotions that they've never experienced before because I've sheltered them from those feelings.
I love that phrase. I want them to learn these things along the way
Hmm.
and not have this, big eye-opening moment in adulthood and not have the coping skills to work with that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, thanks for sharing kind of about grief. Was there anything else that you would want to add to that? Talk about active listening, really just kind of holding
Yeah,
that space.
hold it. I think those are the most important pieces, is that's what we want. That's what we all want for ourselves. Being courageous enough to do that for each other, I think is the goal.
Thank you. That's something I am going to ponder on more and work on listening in a better way. um and I think that listening process and that grief process, it kind of also opens up what really had kind of sparked this desire for this conversation, is this concept of teaching to someone's potential to, with our children, with our partners, within our communities, with ourselves, um, and the people, especially your students, to learn how to do that in a way that isn't this negative feedback loop. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah. So in their field experience or their internships, they have to write papers where they talk about um, how a meaningful experience has touched them in their work with clients and how they show up in that situation. So not necessarily what happened, like a summary, or not necessarily what is going on for the client, but how do they as a clinician process what's happening with them in their work with clients. And when you're a student at a master's level, so these are adults, are getting feedback from someone else, like me, you kind of go back to that elementary fear of the teacher putting a red mark on your paper. That's just kind of built into us in our system, and so I'm very mindful of the feedback that I'm giving to my students. And so, for example, if a student comes in and they talk about having a session with a client and the client turns out to be suicidal and this is their first suicidal client they've been with, they're nervous about, like, who do I call? When do I call? Am I going to keep the relationship with my client? Um, the feedback that I want to give them is recognizing someone who's hurting in the moment is a first priority, and being willing to sit with them and be the ally in their discomfort and in their fear and pain is most important. Second is protecting that client, protecting the agency, protecting the life. Um, so I really give them a lot of praise around that, like recognizing and being able to process all these need to do in the moments with what will build connection and a lasting relationship with a client. So I may give them feedback like, great job recognizing this client is in trouble. I can tell that you really value the relationship that you have with your client, to be sensitive to their needs and how this process looks for that individual. And then I might say, now, how do you build on this experience the next time you work with your client when the client
Mm.
comes in? How do you build on, because you just had this really intense emotional experience, how do you use it to grow? So that might be an example of the feedback I might give to someone. There tends to be themes that come up with in papers and over time when the students are talking to me through their field logs, as we call them, and you can kind of see it. So I kind of get to nurture them, and a lot of them I get to nurture them over 2 years, to talk about, like, look, last
Mm.
year you're really intimidated if someone of the opposite gender, someone older than you, like the certain clientele where you had imposter syndrome, you felt like they knew more than you did, and so you weren't the right fit for them. And talking about more of like, but you have the human connection. You bring yourself to the table. You bring your relationship. And honestly, um, without being human, without having wounds, without what we call the wounded healer, you can't really heal anyone else because you have no experience of what they're going through. And so that human experience is more important than the demographic connection you have with someone.
That's
Thank you.
beautiful. Yeah.
And that gives them permission to kind of explore what they bring to the table. And so I spend a lot of my time talking about, like, how do you see your own personal growth in this
Mm.
experience with clients? Not worrying about the outcomes of clients, because I believe innately we have the ability to heal ourselves. And what you're creating with your clients is that space for them to create and cure themselves. And so what we have to do is get out of the way of our clients doing that. And that a lot of times is hard for clinicians because they have these huge expectations of they're curing someone else. And they're not. And so allowing themselves to recognize, like, where am I interfering in this process? Where do I get too much in my head or have my own biases that step in and interfere with someone else's work? And so that's the feedback I'm providing to them as their instructor, is where are they showing up and providing that space very well for the clients for the
Mm.
healing, and where might their own insecurities and self values interfering with that process.
That's powerful. And and how is that received differently than maybe like traditional feedback?
Um, Traditional feedback I would say, what they tend to students have tend to tell me that other professors will do is, like, you don't forget the policy, like, for example, the one with the suicide. Remember, safety comes first. You're a mandatory reporter. Are you creating a safety plan and, doing all the documentation right? And really
Right.
that comes about protecting ourselves, the clinicians, and not the client. And the clients read through that. So traditional feedback is like, are you doing the right things, the right steps in the right order? Versus mine saying, this is what you're doing well, and here's some areas that you can expand on as you continue to work
Mm.
through um, your clinical skills and your clinical work with clients. So I think it's a little different. I don't see a lot of the other professors' papers or their feedback. I think in higher education, getting feedback in general is not as intensive as you would think.
Mm.
You know, and because there's not necessarily a right and wrong. So a lot of students will say, all I get is good job, you did well. Kind of a platitude to what they're doing, and not necessarily something that looks at them and is invested in who they are as students and the work they're doing with clients.
And have you found with your own boys in like the way you communicate with them? Like none of us are perfect, but have you found that you can also apply that to your day-to-day family
Absolutely.
life?
Absolutely. Um, every child is different, as we all know as mothers and find out. My oldest is very much like my husband, and they butt heads. And it's quite funny because my husband will be like, how do you work with him? Like, how do you figure it out? And I'm like, same thing I do with you. And part of it is they're so flooded with emotion that if I don't acknowledge the emotion, like, everything has to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to address the emotion. And once we've addressed the emotion, then they're very intuitive to figure out what the solution is
Mm,
cognitively. And so
mm,
my son, if he's like, I'm not going to school today, and he's in his bed and he's like huddled in the corner, if I don't comfort him and the feelings that he's feeling of I don't want to
mm,
do something, then we're not going to get anywhere. And so helping him recognize that, giving him the cuddle, and then allowing him to process of like, okay, we have responsibilities that we need to do. What's, how are we going to do that? And oftentimes he'll just get up and he'll get dressed and he'll go out the door. But if I'm like, you need to get out the door, and this is, these are the steps, this is the way you're supposed to do it, I just might as well walk away. Honestly, it's more helpful.
so what I hear you saying is like naming the emotion, sitting with him, providing whatever, he needs in that, but then you're not the problem solver either.
No.
Like I heard you saying that with your students, that you're not the one coming like in consulting, like that's what you do is you come up with the answer, but where in, a therapy session, you're really empowering them to do the problem solving and figure it out within themselves. Cause that's the tool we want them to have, right? Like that's how we want them to learn how to cope.
Yes. Yes. It's the same thing. It's sitting with someone else's discomfort and then allowing them to work through it.
Mm,
We kind of talk about, I call it in the grief therapy class, I call it walking through the wilderness with someone. We're not saving them from the wilderness. We're not saving them for the darkness they're experiencing. And we're not guiding them. We're not providing a light. We're being present with them in that experience. And they'll tell us what they need. They'll very clearly say, I need this. I can't be alone, they'll say. Or they'll say, I feel unloved. I just need time. No one understands me. They'll express it to you what they're, I need to be, no one understands me means I need to be understood.
mm.
So they're telling us exactly what they need. We just have to get out of the way. And kind of like we've talked about, like you learn all of these skills, how to be a therapist, how to be a clinician, how to be a social worker, and you have to throw it all out the window and just show up as you, completely free, open to whatever that person needs. And if you can do that, you're going to be fabulous, because we don't do that very often in life.
Well, and from my own experience with coaching clients, it's taken me a few years to figure this out, that like I can't prepare even for this interview. Like as much as I love to be in control and organized, I can't prepare for it because I want to create the space so that whatever your intuition or whatever you're feeling called to share isn't clouded by my own bias.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's hard too. And clients or other people, like just for me coming into it, I want to make you happy. I want to give you what you're looking for. And those expectations that we have for each other really set us up for failures a lot of time, instead of just being two dynamic, organic individuals sitting down having a conversation about how do we show up for each other, is essentially
Yeah.
what we're talking about. Like, how do we
Yeah.
show up and really be there for each other when we are grieving, whatever that is?
And it's so simple and so beautiful at the same time that so often it's not the big, meal or the whatever, but it's just even that togetherness and silence and that ability just to have somebody be there and to know that they're there, um, is so beautiful and so impactful. Um, what else do you want our listeners to know today?
When you were just saying that, it made me think of something we've started in the last few weeks, about 6 or 7 weeks. My husband and I went to a meditation retreat. And one of the big impressions I got was no phones after 5. No phones after 5. Like, once the kids are in bed, if we need that, my husband and I need that, we can, but no phones in our room, no technology in our room, and no
Mm.
devices at all after 5. And what I found was something I already knew as a clinician, but the behaviors, the hard behaviors around getting our kids in bed completely went away.
Wow.
Like we would struggle. It'd take us like 2 hours, like chasing around. But part of that is we were on our phones checking messages and we're not very present. And soon as we all made that rule, and my kids are really good at making sure that my husband and I um, are abiding by that as well. Family time, us being present during family time or getting ready for
Mm.
bed has really changed it. This morning we woke up, and mornings, of course, can be hard too if you've got young kids. And we just kind of cuddled in bed for about 5 minutes and came up with rhyming words. And everyone got to choose, I throw a word out and then they got to choose words that rhymed with it and make a little poem out of it. Just fun things like that that should be aha years ago, but in the moment just became like, hey, and then they're leaving for school happy. They're leaving, feeling loved and cared. And that took maybe 5 minutes of personal touch, of laughter, of enjoying being present with each other. And then, okay, now let's do our task. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with my oldest son,
Mhm.
like acknowledge the feeling, make connection,
Mm.
have the connection, have the space to be present with each other, and then do the task that you need to do.
Mm.
Same thing that I'm teaching my students. Have the connection with your clients, have the space provided for them, and then the tasks that need to be done will be done.
Well, I'm also having kind of this download right now that I think it's so often when my kids are having those quote unquote big emotions, meaning the uncomfortable emotions like anger, like madness, like just a lot of those like agitated emotions, like that's when like we name them. But what I'm also realizing that you're saying is it's in those moments of cuddling, like how does this feel in this moment, like in those positive moments too, like, oh, I can see you're really happy today, I can see you're smiling more, tell me more about what that was, and helping them to recognize those other emotions.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes across the board again, that paying attention to the positive
Mm.
and being present in the moment to recognize those things are just as important, if not, I would argue, even more so
Mm.
when those negative emotions are there, or
Yeah.
those big emotions that we're uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
Because then they recognize mom's not just there when things are going wrong, mom's there when things are going right too.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for that. We had a big winter storm Saturday night. Our power was out for, I don't know, 6 hours on Sunday, which ended up being a really great blessing, because what happens when the power's out is that the Wi-Fi is also out. And it was great on a Sunday to look at kind of the patterns, and for myself, especially, like, how have I conditioned myself to be like, to go off and read, or to go off and, clean my office, or, whatever those things are. But instead, we're cold. So we get the jet boil out, and, we're making hot water and hot chocolate, and we're very, very present in that. And we're not having that constant distraction of, checking the phone, checking emails. It's especially work has over the last like 10 years just, continues to creep into, even our weekends. And the gift of not having power and being able to play Candyland, I don't know how many times, was such a reminder of like, oh yeah, this is what we can do.
Uh-huh.
And then, also having a lot of gratitude for, power and the ability to heat our food and to stay warm. But that helped us to reset for the week, to say, hey, we are changing our Wi-Fi times. This is what is expected. We are not doing devices on Sundays. And already, what day are we on? Tuesday. It's only been 2 days, but I can see a shift in the kids. And that, like you're saying, like that bedtime routine where, especially as the parents, we're still like multitasking everything instead of like, hey, let's go read a book, or let's go all, snuggle together and play with the dogs. I think that's a great reminder of creating the sacred space. And that's, you had a phrase for it, that sacred family time.
Mhm. Yeah. The other piece too is for me, who's used to being in charge and controlling my schedule. Like Sunday night is our family game night, and it's a board game or a card game. That's what we do. And my son wanted to play musical chairs, and I'm like, I am not playing musical chairs. We don't even have 3 chairs. Like, we don't have
Right.
how do we do this? And then I was like, give it up, play musical chairs. And you know what? It turned out to be the funnest thing. And why not play musical chairs? Why do we have to play Uno, right? It's about spending time together and enjoying each other and being present. And we got that out of musical chairs.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I would just say thank you for creating this space for us to be
Thank
able
you.
to share with each other of, how do we support each other? How do we be present? How do we be giving and loving, on a regular basis?
Oh, thank you. It's absolutely an honor to talk to you, and appreciate you sharing all that you know, and hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you, Kathy.